In the year 334 BC, a young man stood on the edge of the Hellespont, staring across the waters into Asia. His name was Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon. And though only 20 years old, he was about to launch one of the most extraordinary military campaigns the world had ever seen. To the Persians, he would become Alexander the Accursed. To the Greeks, and later to the West, he would be remembered as Alexander the Great. For centuries, Greece had been a land of warriors, philosophers, and artists. Athens, with its navy, had nurtured democracy, drama, and thought, while Sparta, austere and disciplined, had built the most feared army of its age. United, they had once repelled mighty Persia at battles like Thermopylae and Salamis. Yet, in the years that followed, Athens and Sparta turned their strength against each other, dragging Greece into decades of ruinous wars. By the mid-4th century BC, the Greek city-states lay exhausted and divided, vulnerable to a power they had long mocked as backward. Macedonia, that kingdom, mountainous and rugged, had been dismissed by sophisticated Greeks as a land of half-barbarians. But under King Philip II, Macedonia transformed itself into a war machine. Philip's greatest innovation was the sarissina, a pike wielded by soldiers packed into the dreaded phalanx. With these long spears bristling like a forest of iron, his army became unstoppable. In 338 BC, at Chaeronea, Philip crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. With victory, he united Greece in the Hellenic League, proclaiming himself leader of a grand war against Persia. The Persian Empire was wealthy, immense, but decaying. Its riches seemed ripe for plunder. But Philip would not live to lead the invasion. On the eve of his campaign, he was struck down assassinated by one of his own bodyguards, a victim of court intrigue. The throne passed to his son, Alexander. Alexander was no ordinary youth, tutored by Aristotle himself. He had grown up studying philosophy and science, but also lived for the clash of arms. He had already proven himself a commander, leading troops in battle at just 16. Now, as king, he wasted no time securing his rule. He ordered rivals executed. He crushed rebellions in Illyria and Thessaly. And when Thebes dared to rise against him, he razed the ancient city to the ground, selling its people into slavery. The message was clear. Alexander would not be challenged. By the spring of 334 BC, he was ready to fulfill his father's dream. He gathered an army of 40,000 men and led them across the Hellespont into Asia. At the tomb of Achilles, his hero, Alexander made an offering, vowing to achieve glory that would outshine all others. His army was a marvel of organization. At its core stood 9,000 Macedonian bristling with their trained to fight in unbreakable formation. Guarding their flanks were the elite infantry armed with shorter spears, ready to counter swift attacks. Alongside them fought Greek hoplites, armed allies and mercenaries, light troops from Thrace, Illyria, and the Agrian, masters of the javelin. But the heart of Alexander's strength lay in his companion cavalry, 1,800 noble horsemen, armed with spear and sword. These were the king's hammer, his shock troops. Alexander himself rode at their head, gleaming in bronze, a lion in human form. The Persian Empire was vast, stretching from the Mediterranean to India. Its governors, or satraps, ruled like kings in their provinces. In Asia Minor, the satraps gathered to meet this audacious Macedonian boy. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek general serving Persia, urged them to burn the land and starve Alexander out. It was wise counsel, but pride and politics prevailed. They would face Alexander in open battle at the river Granicus. The Granicus was not wide, but its steep banks made it treacherous. On the far side, 10,000 Persian cavalry formed a glittering wall of horse and steel, with Greek mercenary infantry waiting behind. Alexander did not hesitate. Against the advice of his generals, he ordered an immediate attack. First, a squadron of cavalry splashed into the river, followed by infantry. Then Alexander himself led the charge, driving his horse into the torrent. Arrows and javelins darkened the sky. Persian horsemen thundered forward, blades flashing. In the chaos, Alexander found himself face to face with Persian nobles. One swung his sword so fiercely it split Alexander's helmet. Dazed but alive, the young king thrust his lance into his attacker's chest. Another Persian raised his weapon to strike him from behind, but Black Cletus, Alexander's comrade, cut the man's arm clean off before the blow could fall. The fighting was desperate, but Alexander's audacity bought time. One by one, his men crossed the river. The Macedonian phalanx surged forward, a wall of iron that no cavalry could withstand. The Persians broke. Their cavalry fled. The Greek mercenaries, abandoned by their allies, begged for mercy. Alexander gave none. Encircled, they were slaughtered to the last. The riverbank ran red with blood. Alexander had won his first great battle against Persia. Asia Minor now lay open before him, but this was only the beginning. Persia was a land of immense wealth, armies, and kings. To take it, Alexander would have to face Darius, king of kings himself. After his victory at the Granicus, Alexander swept across Asia Minor. One city after another surrendered. Sardis, the capital of Lydia, opened its gates without a fight. Yet the Persian Empire was not beaten. Its power lay not in scattered cities, but in the will of its king, Darius III, king of kings. Darius commanded wealth beyond imagining, and armies that could dwarf Alexander's. To defeat him would mean facing the full might of Persia. But Alexander was no ordinary foe. Instead of challenging Persia's navy, which could sever his lifelines to Greece, he struck their ports on land. One by one, he seized coastal cities, tearing the enemy's fleet from its bases. At Miletus and Halicarnassus, resistance was fierce, but by winter the strongholds fell. In the spring of 333 BC, he pressed inland. At Gordium, he was shown the Gordian knot, a tangled rope said to prophesy. Many had failed to untie it. Alexander did not waste time struggling. He drew his sword, and with a single stroke cut it in half. Destiny, he believed, could not be bound. Meanwhile, Darius gathered a vast army, some claimed nearly 100,000 strong. From every corner of his empire came soldiers, Persian immortals in glittering armor, cavalry from Armenia and Bactria, mercenaries from Greece itself. With this force, Darius sought to crush the upstart Macedonian king. The two armies met on a narrow plain by the river Panaris, near the town of Issus. The mountains pressed on one side, the sea on the other. Here, Persia's numerical advantage could not unfold. Alexander commanded about 40,000 men, half the size of Darius's host. He placed his trusted general Parmenion on the left with Thessalian cavalry, while in the center the Macedonian phalanx bristled with sarissas. Alexander himself rode on the right, leading his companions. Darius arrayed his Greek mercenaries in the center, his immortals nearby, and masses of cavalry toward the sea. Then he waited, confident in his strength. The clash began with a roar. Alexander, shouting encouragement by name to his men, charged on the right. His cavalry smashed into the Persians, driving them back with speed and fury. But in the center, disaster loomed. The Macedonian phalanx, struggling to keep up, lost its order. Against them pressed Darius's Greek mercenaries, heavily armed and disciplined. Step by step, the phalanx was forced back. Alexander saw the danger. Without hesitation, he wheeled his cavalry and hurled them straight into the Persian center. His charge tore into the mercenaries' flank. The Macedonian phalanx rallied and surged forward once more. Then Alexander cut his way toward the royal chariot. For a heartbeat, Darius looked upon the young conqueror racing toward him. Spear leveled, eyes blazing, panic seized him. The King of Kings turned and fled. As news spread that their ruler had abandoned the field, the Persian army collapsed. The battlefield became a slaughter. Among the spoils, Alexander captured Darius's own family, his mother, wife, and children. Yet the conqueror, unlike many of his age, treated them with dignity and honor. Word spread. Alexander was a destroyer in battle, but merciful in victory. Issus was a triumph. Persia's greatest army had been shattered, and the path to its empire opened wide. But Alexander knew that Persia's navy, though weakened, could still strike. To secure the Mediterranean, he marched south, demanding submission from Phoenicia's great cities. Most obeyed, but Tyre, proud and defiant, refused. Built on an island half a mile offshore, with towering walls and a powerful fleet, it seemed unassailable. Alexander would not be denied. He ordered a great causeway built across the sea, protected by massive siege towers. The Tyrians fought back with fire ships, setting the towers ablaze. But Alexander rebuilt, stronger than before. For 7 months, the siege dragged on. At last, his engines battered a breach in the walls. Macedonian soldiers poured into the city. Tyre was taken in blood and fire. Thousands were killed or enslaved, their proud defiance ground into dust. The Mediterranean was now Alexander's. Alexander pressed south to Egypt. Here, the Persian governors surrendered without a fight to the Egyptians, long oppressed by Persian rule. Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. At Memphis, the priests crowned him pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city destined for greatness, Alexandria. In the desert, he journeyed to the oracle of Siwa, where priests proclaimed him son of Ammon, the king of the gods. To his soldiers, he was already more than mortal. To Alexander, this was confirmation of destiny. But Persia was not yet broken. In 331 BC, Darius raised another colossal army, perhaps 80,000 strong, gathering men from across his empire. On the plains of Gaugamela, near modern Mosul, he waited. The ground had been cleared and leveled for his scythed chariots-bladed vehicles, meant to tear through enemy ranks. Alexander commanded perhaps half the numbers, but his army was drilled to perfection. He placed Parmenion with cavalry on the left, the phalanx in the center, and himself, as always, with his companions on the right. The battle began with a feint. Alexander advanced his right wing outward, drawing Persian cavalry away from the center. Darius, fearing encirclement, shifted troops to block him, weakening his own line. Seizing the moment, Alexander led a thunderous charge straight into the gap. His companions smashed into the Persian center, spears driving deep, cutting a path toward the King of Kings. Darius's scythed chariots were useless, their crews cut down by javelins or funneled harmlessly through. Lanes opened in the phalanx. Alexander bore down on Darius once more. The great king, terrified, turned his chariot and fled again. His army, seeing their leader abandon them, broke in panic. The field belonged to Macedonia. The Persian Empire's might had been shattered beyond repair. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis opened their gates to Alexander. He took the throne of Persia itself, not as conqueror alone, but as its new ruler. Yet for Alexander, this was not enough. He had tasted victory, and the world itself seemed within reach. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire lay in ruins. The royal cities of Babylon and Susa welcomed Alexander as their new king. In the mountain pass, known as the Persian Gates, a brave force tried to delay him, but the Macedonians outflanked and destroyed them. By 330 BC, Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. Here, in halls adorned with golden treasures, Alexander made a fateful choice. He ordered the city looted and burned. Whether it was retribution for Persia's burning of Athens a century earlier, or a drunken act of vengeance, the flames consumed the city. Darius fled east, hoping to raise yet another army, but his governors betrayed him. He was captured and murdered by one of them, Bessus of Bactria. Alexander could catch him. When Alexander arrived, he found only the dying king. He ordered Darius buried with honor among his ancestors. To Persia, Alexander now claimed to be not just a conqueror, but the rightful heir. The vast empire needed order. Alexander appointed satraps, sometimes Persians, sometimes Macedonians, to govern in his name. He allowed many Greeks to return home, though most chose to remain with him. His ambition had become theirs, but he could not rest. Bessus declared himself king and raised resistance in the east. Alexander swore to bring him down. Alexander marched through Afghanistan, facing endless revolts and ambushes. In city after city, he founded colonies Alexandrius to secure his rule. At Herat, at Kandahar, at Kanduz, his name marked the map. At last, Bessus was betrayed by his own men and delivered in chains. Alexander sent him back to Persia for execution. But even without Bessus, resistance flared. The tribes of Sogdia and Bactria fought a brutal guerrilla war. Fortresses had to be stormed, villages subdued, raids crushed. It was here that Alexander began to change. He adopted Persian dress and customs, expecting his Macedonians to bow before him in the ritual of proskynos. To the Greeks, only gods received such honor, his men grumbled. Worse, Alexander grew ruthless. Suspicion fell upon his trusted general Philotas, accused of concealing a plot. Under torture, Philotas confessed. Alexander ordered him executed and sent assassins to kill his father, the great Parmenion, before he could rebel. At a drunken feast in Samarkand, Alexander quarreled with Cletus, the Black, the man who had once saved his life at the Granica. In a rage, Alexander struck him down with his own hand. Sober, he wept bitterly, but the deed could not be undone. In 327 BC, Alexander sought peace through alliance. He married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian noble. She was said to be strikingly beautiful, and though the marriage eased local resistance, many Macedonians saw it as a betrayal of their traditions. Plots brewed even in his court. When royal pages conspired against him, Alexander had them stoned to death. Even his historian, Callisthenes, was accused and perished in prison. The king seemed untouchable, yet increasingly feared. Still, his eyes turned east. Beyond the mountains lay India, and Alexander believed that at its farthest river lay the edge of the world. Crossing the towering Hindu Kush, his army descended into the lush valleys of the Indus. Tribal kingdoms resisted fiercely. At Masaga, a stronghold of the Asacheni, resistance was broken only after days of bloody siege. Legends told of a queen who bargained with Alexander and was spared, perhaps even bearing him a child. At Taxila, near modern Islamabad, the local ruler allied with Alexander, offering elephants and guides. Together they marched to confront Porus, king of the Pauravas, on the banks of the Hydaspes River. The battle that followed was unlike any Alexander had faced. Porus commanded a mighty army, but at its heart were war elephant-stowering beasts armored for battle, terrifying both horse and man. Under pouring rain, Alexander led a daring night march, crossing upstream to surprise Porus. The clash was ferocious. Macedonian cavalry darted in, only to be crushed beneath charging elephants. The beasts rampaged, tusks goring, trunks hurling men aside. Yet discipline won the day. Javelins and arrows felled elephants one by one. Cavalry outflanked Porus's lines. At last, wounded and surrounded, the Indian king was captured. Alexander, impressed by his bravery, asked Porus how he wished to be treated. The king replied, "Like a king." Alexander granted him back his lands and more besides. It was a costly battle, but Alexander now held the Punjab. Alexander yearned to march farther, to the river Ganges, said to mark the edge of the earth. But his men had endured enough. 8 years of campaigning, thousands of miles from home. Endless battles, rumors of vast Indian armies waiting ahead. At the river Hyphasis, they refused to go further. For the first time, Alexander yielded. He turned his army back. But the journey home would prove as deadly as any battle, denied the march to the ends of the earth. Alexander turned his army south, following the rivers of the Punjab toward the sea. The journey was brutal. Tribal clans resisted fiercely. At Multan, while scaling a wall, Alexander was struck in the chest by an arrow. His men thought him dead, but he rose, bleeding yet unbroken, rallying his troops to victory. By the time they reached the coast, his soldiers were weary shadows of the army that had once stormed across Asia. Alexander divided them. Part of his force, under his admiral Nearchus, sailed along the coast through uncharted waters to Persia. It was one of antiquity's great voyages. The rest marched with Alexander himself across the burning sands of the Gedrosian desert. Here, heat and thirst ravaged the army more cruelly than any enemy. Men collapsed in the dunes, dying by the thousands. Yet Alexander pressed on, refusing to turn back, as if proving to himself that no obstacle, not even nature itself, could deny him. At last they staggered into Persia. The empire, though vast, was restless. Satraps had grown corrupt in his absence. Alexander executed governors, purged traitors, and reimposed his authority. In Susa, he staged a grand spectacle. To bind Macedonians and Persians, he arranged mass weddings. 80% of his officers wed Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself took 2 Persian brides, alongside his beloved Roxana, to his soldiers who longed for home. This was another sign their king had become half Persian himself. He also recruited 30,000 Persian youths, training them in the Macedonian way of war. Too many of his veterans, it was unthinkable. They had fought for Alexander, but they did not wish to be replaced. At Apis, near Babylon, their anger exploded. Macedonian troops mutinied, shouting that they wished to go home. Alexander, furious, executed the ringleaders. Then he stood before his army and gave a fiery speech, reminding them of the glories they had shared, the victories they had won together, and how he had shared their hardships every step of the way. Shame washed over the men. They wept, begging forgiveness. Reconciled, Alexander sent the old veterans home with gifts, while the young Persians filled their ranks. But even conquerors cannot master fate. In 324 BC, Alexander's closest companion, Hephaestion, fell ill and died. Struck with grief, Alexander mourned as if the world itself. He fasted, refused to eat, and ordered immense funeral rites. Cities across the empire were commanded to honor Hephaestion as a demigod. For the first time, cracks showed in the invincible king's spirit. Still, Alexander dreamed of more. Arabia was to be his next conquest. Fleets were being built, armies prepared, ambassadors from distant peoples, Scythians, Gauls, came to Babylon, acknowledging his greatness. The world seemed to bend before him. Then, suddenly, he fell ill. A fever gripped him. Day after day, he grew weaker, until he could no longer speak. His generals asked who should succeed him. According to legend, he whispered only to the strongest. In June 323 BC, at the age of 32, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He had never lost a battle. In just over a decade, he had carved an empire stretching from Greece to India, one of the largest the world had ever seen. Yet it was an empire held together only by his name, his brilliance, his will. With his death, it began to fracture. His generals, the Diadochi, fought one another to carve out kingdoms of their own. Roxana and Alexander's infant son were murdered. His golden sarcophagus, meant for Macedonia, was stolen and placed in Alexandria, Egypt, where its fate remains a mystery to this day. And yet, Alexander's mark on history endured. The lands he conquered entered the Hellenistic age, where Greek language, art, and ideas mingled with the cultures of the East. Cities he founded became centers of learning and trade. His legend inspired Romans, Persians, and generals for centuries to come. He was reckless, ruthless, and brilliant. To his enemies, he was a curse. To his men, he was a god in armor. To history, he remains Alexander the Great, the boy who sought to rule the world, and came closer than any man before him.